1907, which shows that every traditional alternative to the system of Hegel's self-developing absolute is self-contradictory, and every position breaks down, and this forms it in itself a systematic ladder to the philosophy of the self-unfolding absolute. This is the first thesis. The second thesis, the philosophy of objective spirit is part of this systematic proof. It is methodologically based on the system of categories, or the science of logic, the first part of Hegel's system. But this science of logic is not just a deduction of categories which then have to be applied. It's itself verified if it explains the other parts of the system. So it's sort of what is today called a reflexive equilibrium between the science of logic and the other parts of the system. At the same time, the philosophy of objective spirit can be read as a piece of classical practical philosophy. So not principally as a part of the system, as a part of the proof of the absolute, but as a piece of classical practical philosophy, which is, of course, more familiar to you, named as ethics and politics. Practical philosophy is ethics and politics as treated by Aristotle, Hobbes, Rousseau, etc. And I choose in my lecture today the second option. I don't treat with the philosophy of spirit as part of the proof of the absolute, but as a part of classical practical philosophy. And I stick to the philosophy of right, especially. Third thesis for Hegel, the philosophy of culture or spirit has to give a systematic and partly critical reconstruction of the spirit of its own time, of Hegel's time, with some lasting normative and institutional results. Although Hegel says that philosophy cannot foresee the future, but he still claims that part of his results go beyond his contemporary culture, have a valid meaning after that. According to his philosophy of history, the culture of his contemporary Europe, the Europe of 1800, 1820, is the most advanced culture. Therefore, he is reconstructing this culture, but it conserves the true heritage of its predecessors. So even ancient Iran, ancient Greece, medieval, their results are preserved or conserved, as he claims. His critical reconstruction of his culture, the culture of his time, refers to an early industrial society around 1800, 1820, the beginning of industrialization, a post-revolutionary society in the sense of the French Revolution, with a dominating culture, which is a Christian culture in Europe, of course, but a rather disenchanted, to use the expression of Max Weber, so not a magical, not a ritual Christian, but a rather disenchanted, rather enlightened. And it refers to a state as supreme source and executor of equal rational laws for all citizens, tolerating different convictions. So in this sense, it's a secular state. We come back to this question later. Hegel's concept of rationality, or Vernunft, is a further development of the Enlightenment, but the German Enlightenment, especially Kant and Fichte, and the German Enlightenment, in contrast to radical French Enlightenment, is neither materialist, nor atheist, nor anti-religious. In contradiction, it aims at reconciliation of reason and faith. The strength of the modern state is, in Hegel's view, the liberation of the rights and interests of individuals and social groups within a secular civil society. Its dynamic, the dynamic of this civil society and its active groups, has to mediate it with the unity of a sovereign state. Mediation is a process not by force or by doctrines, but a process of mutual recognition. We come back to this later. This is a very important part of Hegel's system. Mutual recognition between I and you, and between I and we, or the I and the group, the I and the institution, the I and the state. Fifth, say this, to this liberation belong basic rights of free thinking and acting, including private property, free choice of professions and associations, and an exchange of goods by private contracts. So Hegel supports market relations. However, these market relations are also explosive and can produce crisis. Without some steering and compensating instances, such as professional organizations and social welfare state institutions, economic freedom provokes social crisis. There's a famous theory of economic and social crisis, which some people interpret as still valid diagnosis of capitalism, but Hegel does not conceive of a society without economic crisis. He only thinks of mitigation and compensation of these crises and of a sort of what he calls sublation, meaning that the devotion to common causes of a constitutional state overcomes the private interests and their frustration. So you can tolerate some mild crisis within a rational state. Sixth thesis, a state respecting the freedom of convictions and purposes demands independence from every religious institution. However, if religious doctrines and authorities recognize the supreme legislating and judiciary authority of the state, a mutual support of state and religion is possible, and Hegel wants it. Hegel thinks it's important for both state and religion. Hegel's seventh thesis, Hegel's modern society and state contains, from our 21st century view, both lasting and, in my view, also some untenable elements or obsolete elements. It is controversial within Hegel research and interpretation to what degree the latter, the untenable elements, are bound to a systematic view of the absolute and the system. Some say it doesn't belong to it, it's just a superficial accommodation to his times. If it does belong to, and I'm inclined to see that it belongs to maintain the lasting insights would demand either to separate them from the system or to transform the system. So far in my thesis 4 to 6, his view of modernity is still acceptable. Now comes the more problematic parts of Hegel's theory of objective spirit. Eighth thesis, for Hegel, state constitutions demand a functional division of power, but not a real mutual control between the powers. So what in the Anglo-Saxon tradition is called the checks and balances. These institutions are not democratic yet, not yet democratic in a modern sense. Democracy would guarantee that every group has the same political impact. This is not the case in Hegel. There's an imbalance in favor of a strong civil service, educated by philosophy in the end, and a hereditary monarchy in accordance with this time, especially with the Vienna Congress, the solution of the Napoleonic Wars. However, in Hegel, without a prominent aristocracy, the aristocracy is not important for Hegel. The monarchy and the bureaucracy. Ninth thesis, in view of the historical experiences after Hegel's death, and now these experiences, especially European, but also experience in the colonized world, his concept and institution of national sovereignty seem too strong. That's my criticism of them. For Hegel, the state is an ultimate end, or an end itself, an unmoved end, as he called it. Whereas in modern constitutions, for instance, the German Article 1 of the German Constitution is that human dignity is the end of the state and the limit of the state's sovereignty. In Hegel, the top of the executive, namely the monarch and his court and his bureaucracy, has the sole authority in questions of emergency, both internal as external, namely war. in these cases derogating every particular right, whereas in modern international law and the modern constitutional law, there are limits, even in states of emergency. 10th thesis, the experiences of colonialism and totalitarianism in the 19th and 20th century, the development of democracy and international law point in another direction as regards state sovereignty. State sovereignty has to be limited to fulfill the responsibility to protect. That's the clause of the United Nations Assembly a few years ago, the responsibility to protect, which is a limit of states' sovereignty. The state has to protect the basic rights and autonomy of its citizens, individuals and groups. This demands a stronger division of power, as Hegel has, a primacy of the legislative power, an independent constitutional court, and other controlling institutions. And it requires a binding international law, which Hegel doesn't accept. He even criticizes Kant's position in international law, which is more modern from a contemporary point of view. 11th thesis, in my view, there are other interpretations in Germany, in England, in the US. In my view, the deficits are connected to basic traits of Hegel's conception of system and absolute idea. So they are not only superficial. The sovereignty of the state is a manifestation of the absolute idea. In the end of the logic, in the final chapter of the logic, Hegel says that the absolute idea concentrates all its determinations into a single personality. It's controversial what kind of personality, whether it's a human, a divine, or is just a logical structure, but it is a concentration of all determinations in a single personality, and to this corresponds the concentrations of all rights in state sovereignty in emergency cases. In view of evolutionary theories, which Hegel didn't know, cultural pluralism, which is also far from Hegel's Christian European culture, and economic globalization, I think that other models and methods are required. Instead of absolute unification, Hegel's theory belongs to a long tradition of philosophy from early antiquity, perhaps also in Iran, in ancient Iran culture, of one which enfolds itself in everything, one in all, hen kai pan in Greek. Hegel wants to maintain this structure and to make it to reconcile it with modernity and subjectivity, but I don't think it works for modern society anymore. We need conceptions of independent, contrasting as well as corresponding spheres, including a true partnership between spirit and nature, which is outside Hegel's theory of objective spirit, but I think his conception of nature isn't valid for today as well. Nevertheless, important parts of Hegel's philosophy of objective spirit, as well as of his philosophy of subjective spirit, especially the anthropology, remain convincing. Now, my last thesis, 12th thesis, regarding objective spirit, I count among the fruitful elements the theory of mutual recognition, but Hegel, when Hegel develops the theory, he said that there must be a symmetric relation, between I and you, I and we, individual and state. But in the end of his philosophy of state, the relation becomes asymmetric. The state has more rights than the individual, much more rights. So a modern theory of recognition must be symmetric. Other parts of the theory of objective spirit is a partly self-regulating civil society. So there must be a free civil society although in crisis, in economic crisis, the state must help, must compensate. There must be a synthesis between individual rights and customs of solidarity, which Hegel calls ethical life. He's afraid that private egoism in market society will overcome this solidarity. So it must be a counter point of solidarity. And this synthesis of individual rights and customs of solidarity he calls ethical life. And I think that can still be, we can still work out this in a modern way. What is still valid is the state's impartiality in view of different worldviews, especially religions. There cannot be any religious freedom if the state isn't impartial over against different religious community. Also, still interesting, still fruitful is the conception of history as a series of what he calls in the phenomenology experience of consciousness, which he somehow gave up in his late philosophy of history. Experience of consciousness means that in a certain culture you discover contradictions, and to overcome them you must find a new synthesis which results from the experiences. And I think this is a very fruitful conception of philosophy of history. And there are other parts which we have to be elaborate, but I think this is enough.